So my name is Béatrice Duménil, as you rightly introduced me. I am the director of a Master in Management and International Competencies at Audencia, head of the English department. I teach intercultural management, communication skills, and international mobility.
Hello, my name is Christine. I am a professor in human resources management, and I'm mainly teaching all topics that are concerned with how to recruit people in organizations and so on. My research is mainly based on diversity management, so for example how companies integrate disability, also how women can better manage their careers, because it seems to be we are equal but we are different. So I'm looking closer to all these kind of questions. And by the way, Beatrice is British. And I am Austrian.
So that's our diversity. Okay. The reason why we decided to tackle the Survivor's Guide to Tackling Intercultural Communication, being British and being Austrian, we've lived here for a number of years, but we work with international students, with French students, and we're always so surprised about the difficulties that we can encounter. I'm sure a number of you here today are going to be studying or traveling abroad. Any hands up on how many of you are going to be studying perhaps abroad, a semester abroad? Not many, or perhaps great, or even working here in your establishment, having to deal with foreign students. And so what we wanted to do was to try and indicate, a guide on how to deal with this, how to deal with the challenges, and perhaps give you some concrete advice. We shall try not to do too much in terms of stereotypes and cliches, but we will define our concepts and give you some concrete information.
So, first of all, what do we understand by cross-cultural communication? Also often referred to as intercultural communication. So it takes place when at least two persons of two different cultures are interacting and communicating with each other. And it's very important, especially in this context, to understand also the different factors that influence cross-cultural communication. And the idea would be, on the one side, to establish, in fact, successful relationships. So this might be successful personal relationships, but also, of course, business relationships. And on the other side, also to minimize conflicts and misunderstandings. The first question, or the next question we can ask ourselves is also, what is culture? So what do we mean by culture? So if we look at different manuals, if we look at what research tells us about this issue, we can see here on this slide that we use often the metaphor of an iceberg, so culture as an iceberg. And you can also see that there are different layers. So let's say the invisible part of this iceberg, these are the deep underlying assumptions that are shaping the different values and the beliefs and the norms that members of a culture are sharing. So these are collective, this is part of the collective mind. And this is the invisible part. So it's hard to grasp the notions, of course, of this part of the culture. And the second part of what we call culture, this is the more visible part. So we call this the behavior, so how a person behaves. A manager, for example, a Japanese manager who is bowing, so we can see how this manager behaves. Spoken and written words, so language, fairy tales, and any other objects, artifacts, symbols, and so on. So this is really the so-called visible part, and the visible part is shaped by the underlying assumptions and also by the behavioral norms shared by one society. And of course we have to take into account that often we take also culture for granted. So we do not think about it, and it's also part of our unconsciousness. So Beatrice, give us a little bit more precise examples about the culture.
Okay, so culture covers so many different things. Here's a list of certain things that the first thing when you go to a new culture, and most of you have identified that, is a language barrier. So you go, a French person goes to the UK, and the first thing they're going to notice, they've got to speak the lingo, okay? But language can also be, we can all be in the same, have the same language. For example, I'm British, I go to the States, or I speak with an American, or I speak with an Australian or a Canadian, and we speak the same language, but we don't necessarily understand each other. So language can be already a big barrier when it comes to intercultural communication. You have also the question of traditions. Traditions, you have certain traditions here. For example, one of the traditions is your 14th of July, where you're going to celebrate the beheading of your monarchy. Whereas you imagine for the British person, you're talking about beheading the monarchy. I mean, you know, our royal family is just so sacred. It's the Jubilee, weddings, it's part of our economy. So you've got the traditions. You've also got talking about attitudes to the sexes. Often, I mean, we've worked with students and sending them on international assignments. It's very important about the question about attitude to sexes. What can you say to women or not? Can you make jokes about women or gender jokes, which is something that you can, which is more acceptable in France. Even though when we first arrived, I mean, I certainly was shocked by some behavior, but in the UK, and especially in the Americans, very puritanical, and they're not going to accept that. You also have attitudes towards work and leisure, for example. We say about the Americans, if there are any Americans here, I apologize, first of all, it's a bit of a cliche, but the Americans, British, we work hard, we play hard. And it's true that when you arrive in France, and the stereotype of the French, for example, is that you work, but you have so much time. You have 35-hour week. I think you have 11 bank holidays, plus all your holidays. But then when you know that France is one of the top 5 in terms of productivity, that is another misconception. So these are different types of things that you can see which make up culture, and some of it is visible and sometimes it's invisible, and it's important to understand it.
Okay. So we have seen so far what culture means. So now we would like to go more into detail about the different cultural dimensions. So probably all of you know Gerd Hofstede. So he was one of the first researchers looking at the different dimensions of culture. So first of all, he said that there is a factor that is very important, that is the individualism or collectivism factor. That means in what way does culture value individual or collective achievement? For example, France, but also the UK or also the US, are very individualistic countries and cultures. So they have having a very high score on that. And then, of course, there is the other issue about collectivism. So that means a country that is more valuing, in fact, the group. So the group, the family, is more important than the individual. For example, Asian countries, China, are often referred, in fact, when we talk about collectivism.
The next value dimension is power distance, the high or low power distance. This is how a society's members accept inequality in power. You can often see it in management. For example, in some cultures where you have the vertical style of management, where it's pyramids of managers and hierarchies. It's the attitude towards hierarchy in general. So you have some cultures, Latin countries, Latin American, Asian countries, where hierarchy is very established, very imposed. So we talk about the vertical power distance, the vertical management pyramid. In the UK, or for example in Australia, the more Scandinavian countries, they're more on a sort of horizontal style of management. It's true that students who go and travel to English-speaking countries will find it's very disconcerting, for example, when you're in London, to go to the pub with your boss on a Friday, or to call him by your first name, which is not something that you would readily do here in France. You also have the power distance, which for a foreigner, when they first arrive in France, is in the language. You have the tu form and the vous form, and you have to be specifically careful about that, as well as your titles. What titles do you give? And the French society and a lot of Latin countries are very attached to titles because it indicates hierarchy. So the high and the low is the question how society adopts and integrates this hierarchy.
So the next dimension, the third dimension, is the uncertainty avoidance index. So in some cultures, people tend to avoid uncertainty. Of course, in this case, we can cite also the case of France. if we look, for example, at French labor law, so we can say it's a very, very thick book. So the French society tries to avoid uncertainty. They do not like also ambiguity. That means also that, for example, companies, they have big difficulties sometimes, so French entrepreneurs are saying that. So if you recruit someone, it's very difficult to get rid of this person if the person is not performing well, in fact, in a company. So these cultures are also risk averse, so they do not like to take risks, and sometimes they do not like change as well. On the contrary, so companies or countries who like to take risk, like the US, like the UK, so most of the time Anglo-Saxon world, so they have a low uncertainty avoidance index.
The next dimension we're going to see is masculinity and femininity. Basically, we can divide up cultures according to the masculinity, where basically the prime concentration is going to be the success, is going to be on competition, on performance. We can often see this in Anglo, North American societies, where the fact that you are successful, that you are very, very competitive. On the other hand, you've got femininity cultures where the success of the culture is well-being. So you can see, for example, in the Scandinavian countries where there's a lot of concentration on social welfare, the fact that you have holidays, that there is the state which is taking after you or taking care of you, and the question of solidarity. So we have these two dimensions, the masculine and the feminine. So you can imagine that someone from North America arriving into even the French society, where the French are renowned for having an extremely complete health system, where you just don't let people if they're in difficulty, they're not let down. Whereas in American or in British societies, you're individualistic. You just got to get on and try and fend for yourself.
And the last dimension, which was in fact added by Gerd Hofstede later on, it is the long-term and the short-term orientation. So some cultures value, in fact, a long-term orientation. That means that they take into account what we do, in fact, today. What does that mean, in fact, for the future? Often we refer to the environment. So, for example, if we pollute today, so pollution, what does it mean in the forthcoming years? What does it mean for the future generations? And it is considered to be that the Asian cultures have a quite long-term orientation. It is in line also with the Confucius philosophy. And short-term orientation are more the Western societies, because we value also results at the short term. In fact, we would like to run a project, for example, and tomorrow we already must see, in fact, the positive outcomes. And France is also considered to be a country with a quite short-term orientation. Okay, so next we're going to see what is communication. We already talked about cross-cultural communication, but the communication process in general, it means, I guess that's nothing new for you, but it's very important to define, in fact, all the different terms that we are using. So communication means that you have one person, so the person E, the sender is sending, in fact, through a medium, a message to another person, which is the person B, so the receiver here. And what is very important, that in this kind of situation, there might be some disruption, so noise can come in, so it disturbs, in fact, what is going on. And especially when we have two people from two different cultures, there might be an issue with the culture itself, because when the person A says something and the person E can understand it in a different way because of the lens the lens of the culture, in fact, is coming in. And of course, communication is the basis of our relationships, and in the private life, of course, but also in an organizational setting. So when you go on an international assignment, it is very important to be able to communicate with other people in an organizational context, but also in your private life. And there is also this distinction between the verbal and the non-verbal communication. So we're going to go more into detail a little bit later on. But Edward Hall was the first also talking about the context of cultures. So for example, when we talk about the verbal communication, because first of all we're going to put focus on that. So Edward Hall said that there are that there are cultures that are more high context cultures. So high context does mean that we need to read between the lines, because what people say is not always what they mean, and they are not going directly to the point. So there is, and feelings and also the thoughts are not expressed very explicitly. And Beatrice will give us some examples just later on. And then we have, on the other side, low context cultures. This does mean that these are cultures that go more straight to the point. So you do not need so much to read between the lines, because people are quite direct. So they are really meaning what they are saying. But in the high context culture, it is very important to understand the context, first of all, of communication. It is also important to understand the second part, that is the non-verbal communication. So we're going to go into detail later on as well. So Beatrice, can you please explain the next slide?
Yes, Christine, I'm going to explain to you, and this will just give you an example, okay, of the high context and the low context, because as you can see, the high context, where you're going to see a lot of the Asians, Arabs, Arab world, Latin Americans, okay, and the Latin populations in general, societies in general, tend to be very high context. That is to say that there is a lot of surrounding information which is important. And you can see that we work a lot with students on negotiation practices with different intercultural communication and negotiation practices. And it's true that sometimes you understand things which are not just being said, there are other things which are going on. Because often some of the information is introverted, and it's very difficult to get that information. As you can see in the low context, we're seeing more the North Americans, the Scandinavians, the British, who are much more cash, as they say in French, is that they're upfront. And so as a result, you would find that perhaps the high context societies would find, and it's true, why are they being so abrupt? Why are they being rude? It's not because we're being rude, but we're saying exactly what we mean. And you can get examples. For example, a Swiss person is explaining something to a Japanese. The Swiss is going to be so explicit. The Japanese is going to be saying, listen, are you taking me for an idiot? I've fully understood. But the Swiss wants to explain exactly. And vice versa, if someone from Arab world is explaining to the Germans how something works, the German might not quite necessarily understand, because there is not necessarily directive and there's lack in terms of explicit information.
So,
now, in terms of communication, we're talking about verbal, and we're going to have a look at this, because it's true that I took the example of the British, because we've just seen a video, and it's true that one thing, when I work with a lot of alumni working around the world, when I meet with them, they're working in finance, marketing, or whatever, they say, you know, we love working in the UK, but there's one thing we just do not understand, is their sense of humor. It's something which we just do not understand. We do not know if they're laughing or not. It's true that the British can tend to be there's a lot of understatements. They make fun at themselves. And there can be, when we talk in France about being second degree, in Britain we're talking about third, fourth, fifth, sixth degree, okay? So sometimes it's really difficult. So I thought we'd do a little test together about how to decode British speech. So, Christine, if I was to say to you, that's an interesting idea.
Oh, I guess it would mean that's a good idea.
You're wrong. It means that is a really stupid suggestion. The fact that, remember, you have the intonations, etc., the pronunciation. Just take a look at the pronunciations and the pauses, and you'll try and understand better. The next one. You could say that, emphasis on the could.
Yes, you can say that.
The answer would be? The answer would be, you could say that, but frankly, if I were you, I would definitely not say that, okay? The next one is, that's an interesting project. We shall certainly consider it.
Oh, yes, it's a good option.
Well, basically, the answer would be, I would shelve that. I would forget that, okay? Another one we could say, yeah, your project looks like your object has a lot of future potential, you know? And
that would mean, of course, that looks very interesting. It's a good project.
Yeah, well, it's failed, okay? It's failed. just don't go for it. And if I would say, hey, that student, he works, can you recommend this student? What do you think? Well, he works very intuitively. What do you think that means?
We would rather say probably he works good.
He's creative? Well. Yeah, he might be creative. Yeah. Well, let's say he is completely disorganized, okay? He's completely disorganized. Okay, we say that the British are very hypocritical, that they don't always necessarily say, but sometimes you have to understand the language and what is being said behind the language.
Okay, so now let's switch to the, let's say, more important part when we talk about communication. So studies are showing that only 7% of what we are saying is very, very explicitly, and also in an audience, people not just look at what the person who is doing a speech, for example, is saying. What is more important is the way the person does his speech and also how the person behaves in a way. So let's say more than 90% of all the messages that we are giving, these are non-verbal messages. So for example, when we talk about non-verbal behavior, we can talk about kinesthetic behavior. That means facial expressions. Look at this boy here on this slide. So he is expressing himself. He's not using any words, but he's using the non-verbal version. Hand gestures, touching, of course, body contact as well, eye contact, very different from one country to another one, and proxemics, so also the use of space, because you should not invade in some cultures. For example, the Americans, UK, we should not invade the personal space of other people. And BDA. Beatrice, can you explain to us, please, what does BDA mean?
PDA, well, basically, as Christine said, there's the verbal communication and then there's all the non-verbal. And this is where, as students traveling abroad or whoever traveling abroad, you have to have your antennae up. They've got to be looking for what's going on now. The first thing I would say is the body contact, okay? Just touching. The French are very tactile, you know? And the Americans, when they come to our school and they say, hey, you know, you French people, you're kissing the whole time. I mean, you know, you're always touching each other. And there's this PDA, public display of affection. It's an acronym you should know, okay? You just don't touch people in the same way. And there are in certain cultures, like in Singapore, if you start touching a Singaporean, you can be taken to jail for molesting, okay? So it's something I would avoid doing seriously. So be very careful. And the French, they've also got one thing which I found quite surprising when I arrived, is that you shake hands the whole time. You shake hands when you arrive, you shake hands at the end of the day, and it's it's non-going. Whereas in Australia, it's hi mate, how you doing? In the States and in the UK, it would be the same thing. So you've got the body contact, then you've got the closeness. This is another thing which students from other cultures have expressed on arrival, is that the Americans are very clear on this, is that you've got your personal bubble. You have your bubble and you have your private bubble. It is your space, and it's usually about 2 meters or 1.5 meters. I mean, it's conceptual, there's theory around this. So you have your private bubble, and then afterwards you have your social bubble, which is a little bit longer, and then you've got your public bubble. And that is, the bubble is where people should not infringe you on your personal space. So when they take the tram here, I mean, they're living through torture. They really are, because they say, why is everybody moving up and going up into my space? Then you have other things, for example, ways of talking and the stress on words. Some Asian communities, silences are very important, and you mustn't mistake silences in some Asian cultures as being not uninterest. On the contrary, it's where they're being contemplative. So there you're going to see different things, head movements or even eye movements. An Asian, you would not look at them straight in the eye. Okay, it's seen as being rude. Whereas with a British person, you look at them in the eye, because if you're not looking in the eye when you're speaking, you're distrustful. So, Christine, we're going to do a little joke here, okay?
Of course.
What do you think this Japanese gesture means?
Probably, you know, if we are in France, we would say she's got horns, so her husband is probably cheating on her.
Yeah, it could be her husband is cheating on her. No, in Japan, basically what it means is that you're she's angry, okay? I don't know if there are any Japanese here today, but yeah, you're basically angry. What about this French gesture here, which is they start touching their eye?
Oh, look at me, look at my eye.
No, that is something, if somebody says that to you, it basically means, I don't believe you, okay? I don't believe you. And then the Iranian gesture, international gesture. Be careful where you use that gesture. What does that mean?
Thumbs up. Thumbs up means well done, awesome, terrific.
Well, better not do that in Iran because it basically is extremely obscene and basically would get you into a lot of difficulties, okay? So the question of gestures, non-verbal communication is very important to be aware of. Next slide.
Yes. Now we're going to talk about the famous culture shock. Probably you have already experienced it if you have lived abroad for a couple of months. Or you also are in interaction with people from other cultures, from students who are from abroad, who come to Nantes. So we can see that the first stage, it's a model that had been developed by Mendenhall a couple of years ago, but it's still, of course, very valid. And it's the so-called U-curve of cross-cultural adjustment. So there are 4 different phases, and the first phase is characterized by the so-called honeymoon phase. So if you are new in a country, this is a phase that is characterized by curiosity and also excitement, because everything and everyone is new. So let's have an example.
You get the examples when you arrive in a new country, everything is new. Someone who comes here to France, for example, the food is so fantastic. You've got fantastic buildings. The Americans, when they come over here, say how cultured, how polite everybody is over here. So you've got that honeymoon period where everything is new, it's a novelty. But then what happens?
Yes, the second phase is the so-called dark phase. It's called the culture shock phase. So of course not everyone is facing it, but you might, look here on this slide. It's also in line with the time, because after having spent, let's say, roughly 4 to 6 months in another country, you might face, in fact, this culture shock that is accompanied with disappointment and also frustration. So give us an example, Beatrice,
Well, one
please.
of the big examples that I have from people who come over to France, I'm sorry to harp on about France, but is c'est pas possible. This typical statement that comes from everywhere, from administration, you try and get your residence permit, c'est pas possible. You want to change your SNCF ticket, c'est pas possible. So there is this disappointment and frustration because you're going to compare what's going on in your new country with what would have happened at home. Well, at home it would have been so much easier. So there is a beginning of frustration, and you're beginning to compare to what you might have lost out at home.
Yes, but then things are getting better. We are in the adjustment phase. So that means that the individual is adapting slowly and surely to the new culture. It's a phase that is characterized by recovery. So things are getting better, and also learning. So the individual is also learning from the new culture. So also a phase of accepting the other culture.
Yeah, the adjustment is really when, in fact, if you're looking at that iceberg, you're beginning, the top part you've understood, and you're now beginning to understand, to share the other culture's beliefs. You've mastered the language. So this is a period really where your adjustment, and you're really feeling more at home in that new culture.
And last but not least, we do have, in fact, the mastery phase. The mastery phase does mean that the person is more and more understanding, in fact, the other culture, and also more and more adapted to the culture.
And this often leads to dual cultures. And I think that we are two perhaps specimens of this, is that we master the culture so well now, is that we are dual, really bilingual and dual culture, is that we feel at home to such an extent that afterwards we begin to wonder what is our real culture. And this brings us on to the point of perhaps reverse culture shock. And reverse culture shock, just quickly before we go on to the next slide, is the fact that when you go back to your country, country, look at all those expatriates. When they go back to their home country, there is another type of culture shock. They've just got used to working in a new country, and they go back to their home country, and there can be a lot of difficulties. That is why companies, when they send people on international assignments, are integrating this, because the reverse culture shock is that you're coming back to where the other culture's beliefs are. You've mastered the language, so this is a period really where your adjustment and you're really feeling more at home in that new culture.
And last but not least, we do have in fact the mastery phase. The mastery phase does mean that the person is more and more understanding in fact the other culture, and also more and more adapted to the culture.
And this often leads to dual cultures. And I think that we are two perhaps specimens of this, is that we master the culture so well now, is that we are dual, really bilingual and dual culture, is that we feel at home to such an extent that afterwards we begin to wonder what is our real culture. And this brings us on to the point of perhaps reverse culture shock. And reverse culture shock, just quickly before we go on to the next slide, is the fact that when you go back to your country, look at all those expatriates, when they go back to their home country, there is another type of culture shock. They've just got used to working in a new country, and they go back to their home country, and there can be a lot of difficulties. That is why companies, when they send people on international assignments, are integrating this, because the reverse culture shock is that you're coming back to a culture you have left. You are sometimes phased out a little bit about what's going on. You don't recognize yourself in your old type of values, beliefs, etc. And there's a question of readjustment which is necessary. So basically, to help you out, for you who want to go abroad and to succeed abroad, I think that there are the key success factors. I think the first thing that you have to is really to know your own culture, is to be able to have cultural empathy. You've got to be open up already starting off at school when you're working with other cultures. It's to adopt new cultures very rapidly, to see diversity as an opportunity. Diversity is different, but leverage it. This is going to heighten your performance. The more open you are, the better. And show eagerness to work with other cultures. That is essential. And be geographically mobile and flexible. The more flexible you are, the easier it is. And there you will be able to have proven communication skills.
Yes, so these are already a few takeaways from our presentation. And we finish, also we are going to switch to the other side. So what are companies looking for? So they are also searching for young graduates, or graduates in general, who have in fact this kind of cross-cultural awareness. So our message is really go out and go abroad and experience other cultures, be curious, and also learn from other cultures. The other issue would be also languages. So also companies are looking for graduates who are able to master different languages. Still, we speak Globish, so the new kind of English that everyone is speaking, but we are, but Beatrice is British, but I'm from a non-British country, so of course we don't speak English in Austria, we speak German. But the issue is we should master different languages, no matter if we master them very well, so no matter what our level is. The idea is to go out and to learn and to be confronted with other cultures and to also in other contexts. And the next issue, of course, companies are passionate about people who are able to work in a team. So I think, or we think probably this is not new for you, but teamwork is really very important, and also in an international context. It means also that if you want to work for a multinational company, it is important to be able to understand also the team members if they are from different countries. The next issue would also be leadership and influencing. So develop your leadership skills. So on a daily basis, you can do it when you are doing assignments, of course. There are different opportunities during your studies. You can develop them, and it's important to know how to motivate others. And of course, first of all, we should also know how to motivate ourselves. And last but not least, initiative and also flexibility. So companies, they would like to have very flexible people, of course, and also people who are autonomous and able to take initiatives. Responsibility is also, of course, a buzzword. Of course, we should also take into account the technical skills and the business acumen. So business know-how is also very important. That is the basis, of course, we would say. So diplomas are, of course, also important. And last but not least, personality is important. So the interpersonal and also communication skills. So it's important to be able to develop these kind of skills when you are in in the school or at university, and then also later on if you're doing internships, and also when you're searching for the first job.
So we're going to come to a stop here because we're running out of time already. But I hope that this has been you're going to take something out of it. Just know that from the experience that we have working with internationals, working with companies all over the world, you've got your business skills that you've learned here at different institutions. And the other thing is it's the intercultural communication, which is going to make the difference when you're going to be working on international assignments. So open up, learn lots, and get out there internationally.
Thanks for your attention.